Well, welcome to stage 1.3 of European journeys. This is indeed the third stage of a journey that takes us along the footsteps of Paul, the Apostle Paul, in Italy. And today we are going to visit the city of Reggio di Calabria, or the Italians call it simply Reggio Calabria. The D in between is often dropped. Reggio Calabria is the largest city of the region of the same name, Calabria, and it is facing the Strait of Messina, which separates metropolitan Italy with Sicily. And the location we are going to visit today stands at a stone's throw from the Strait of Messina. And I'm talking about the Duomo di Reggio, that's how it's called in Italian. I'm talking about the Cathedral of Reggio. Well, if you remember last week, we were visiting a church in Syracuse that had to be rebuilt in the 18th century because of an earthquake that had happened at the end of the 17th century. Well, here too, the Cathedral of Reggio di Calabria was destroyed by an earthquake, this time in December 1908, so a bit more than 100 years ago. And so the church had to be rebuilt as well. And it was rebuilt in the style, the architectural style of the time, which was the neo-Romanesque style. But even though this is a recent construction, a mark of the early relationship between Reggio and Christianity is engraved on the stones of the semicircular portico of the cathedral. And there we read the following four Greek words: Perielontes catentesamen eis region. Now, if you don't read Greek, you would hardly understand what those words mean. And even though Reggio has a strong historical Greek legacy, and there's even a region not so far from Reggio where the Greek language is still spoken nowadays, nevertheless, the words don't come from some ancient Greek poets, but rather, and as it should be expected for words engraved on the walls of a cathedral, from the Bible. And the English translation of these words simply says, "Having gone around, we arrived at Rhegium." Well, if you have followed our first stages of this journey, you won't be surprised to realize that these words come from the Bible, from the book of Acts, from Luke's reports of Paul's journey, which had started in Caesarea as a prisoner. And so after having left Syracuse a few days earlier, Paul and Luke had traveled 120 kilometers, that is 75 miles, to Reggio, aboard the same Alexandrian boat, which was named Castor and Pollux, that had carried them earlier on from Malta to Sicily. And so here they stayed overnight, and on the next day, they embarked for the rest of their journey towards Rome. So that's what we know from the Bible. We don't know anything more, but just these few words. And so, here too, just as in Syracuse, if you remember in our last stage, while the Bible says nothing about what Paul and Luke would have done in this city, some extra biblical accounts add specific details about what they did, or what especially Paul did, overnight when he stayed here by the Strait of Messina. And so, while these accounts remain historically unconfirmed, they are nonetheless endorsed by the Roman Catholic Church. So firstly, there is a local traditional story which says that Paul arrived during the celebrations to the pagan goddess Diana. And so knowing that Paul was a Christian missionary, the leaders of the city allowed him to preach while the stump of a torch would burn. So there was a torch placed on a stump, and until the torch finished burning, Paul should finish his sermon. And so when the torch finished burning, the story says that the column upon which it was placed began to shine with a bright light until Paul finished his sermon. Well, this wonder filled the audience with awe, and many would have been converted to Christ, according to the story, of course. And secondly, so now many people came to Christ, and obviously a church was formed, and so on the next day, as Paul was leaving Reggio, the tradition says that the apostle left a man named Stephen of Nicaea as the first bishop of the city. So these are the extra biblical accounts that are related to this city. Now, I am not going to discuss now whether these are true or not. We simply don't have historical records about such facts having happened here in Reggio that would support the case. But supposing that Paul did indeed leave Stephen of Nicaea as the first bishop of the church of Reggio, what would have been the instructions that Paul would have left to him before his departure? Where in the Bible we find out that on 2 previous occasions Paul had left Timothy and Titus, respectively in Ephesus and on the island of Crete, and both places were crippled with the worship of false pagan gods, just as it was the case here in Reggio. For example, about the island of Crete, Dr. David Glesny quotes Vishal Mangarwadi in the book The Third Education Revolution, and I quote, "Myth-based religion had created Crete's culture of corruption and distrust. Greek gods exhibited the best and the worst of the characters of their creators. Courage and cleverness on the one hand, jealousy, covetousness, exploitation, trickery, and distrust on the other hand. And as the Greeks trusted their gods, projections of themselves, their behavior came to reflect the behavior of the gods in whom they trusted." And so, in such a context, Paul's teaching to Timothy and Titus gave a moral spine to the church, that is, the community of believers who had turned away from paganism, from these false gods, from the worship of these false gods, and began to worship the true God. And so Paul commanded these leaders to ordain overseers who were married to one wife or who managed their house well, and to teach the believers to care for their families and so on. So you see what Paul is doing here. He is planting communities that are founded in Jesus Christ and where the building blocks are the families. That is the Christian concept of the family, a man married with one woman and with children. So such a community was in stark contrast to the corrupt pagan society of the time. Well, of course, as I said before, we don't know if Paul ever left a man named Stephen of Nicaea in Reggio, let alone if he gave him such instructions. However, his teachings became recognized as inspired by God and followed by countless Christian leaders in the following centuries all around Europe. And so while paganism and ancient philosophies kept humanity bound to social inequalities, Paul had set, as the Oxford scholar Larry Siedentop would say, the basis for the Western understanding of the moral equality of each individual before God. Well, now let's walk a bit away from the cathedral and let's walk towards the sea, along the promenade that is along the Strait of Messina. And there we will find an enormous statue by the sea dedicated to the Greek goddess Athena, who is a goddess that is thought to be defender of the city. Now, we could believe maybe that this is an ancient statue that has remained ever since the pagan times of this city, but sadly this is not the case. This monument was built in the 20th century, and this is a clear sign that Europe is undergoing a certain revival of paganism in our times. And so as these pagan gods inevitably lead society to ethical corruption, the church will need more than ever to be the light of the world and take Paul's teachings seriously again. I'm Cedric Placentino. See you next week for another stage of European Journeys.